The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. Book 2. Prince Caspian. Chapter 6. The People That Lived in Hiding. Now began the happiest times that Caspian had ever known. On a fine summer morning, when the dew lay on the grass, he set off with the badger and the two dwarfs, up through the forest to a high saddle in the mountains, and down on their sunny southern slopes, where one looked across the green worlds of Archenland.
"We will go first to the three bulgy bears,"
said Trumpkin. They came in a glade to an old hollow oak tree covered with moss, and Truffle Hunter tapped with his paw 3 times on the trunk, and there was no answer. Then he tapped again, in a woolly sort of voice from inside said, "Go away. It's not time to get up yet." But when he tapped the 3rd time, there was a noise like a small earthquake from inside, and a sort of door opened, and out came 3 brown bears, very bulgy indeed, and blinking their little eyes. And when everything had been explained to them, which took a long time because they were so sleepy, they said, just as Truffle Hunter had said, that a son of Adam ought to be the king of Narnia, and all kissed Caspian, very wet, snuffly kisses they were, and offered him some honey. Caspian did not really want honey, without bread, at that time in the morning, but he thought it polite to accept. It took him a long time afterwards to get unsticky. After that, they went on till they came among tall beech trees, and Truffle Hunter called out,
"Patter twig! Patter twig! Patter twig!"
And almost at once, bounding down from branch to branch, till he was just above their heads, came the most magnificent red squirrel that Caspian had ever seen. He was far bigger than the ordinary dumb squirrels which he had sometimes seen in the castle gardens. Indeed, he was nearly the size of a terrier, and the moment you looked in his face, you saw that he could talk. Indeed, the difficulty was in getting him to stop talking, for, like all squirrels, he was a chatterer. He welcomed Caspian at once and asked if he would like a nut, and Caspian said thanks, he would. But as Pattertwig went bounding away to fetch it, Truffle Hunter whispered in Caspian's ear,
"Don't look. Look the other way. It's very bad manners among squirrels to watch anyone going to his store, or to look as if you wanted to know where it was."
Then Pattertwig came back with the nut, and Caspian ate it, and after that Pattertwig asked if he could take any messages to other friends.
"For I can go nearly everywhere without setting foot on the ground," he said.
Truffle Hunter and the dwarfs thought this a very good idea, and gave Pattertwig messages to all sorts of people with queer names, telling them all to come to a feast and council on Dancing Lawn at midnight 3 nights ahead.
"And you'd better tell the bulgies too," added Trumpkin. "We forgot to mention it to them."
Their next visit was to the 7 brothers of Shuddering Wood. Trumpkin led the way back to the saddle, and then down eastward on the northern slope of the mountains, till they came to a very solemn place among rocks and fir trees. They went very quietly, and presently Caspian could feel the ground shake under his feet as if someone were hammering down below. Trumpkin went to a flat stone about the size of the top of a water butt, and stamped on it with his foot. After a long pause, it was moved away by someone or something underneath, and there was a dark, round hole with a good deal of heat and steam coming out of it, and in the middle of the hole, the head of a dwarf, very like Trumpkin himself. There was a long talk here, and the dwarf seemed more suspicious than the squirrel or the bulgy bears had been, but in the end, the whole party was invited to come down. Caspian found himself descending a dark stairway into the earth, but when he came to the bottom, he saw firelight. It was the light of a furnace. The whole place was a smithy. A subterranean stream ran past on one side of it. 2 dwarves were at the bellows. Another was holding a piece of red-hot iron on the anvil with a pair of tongs. A 4th was hammering it, and 2, wiping their horny little hands on a greasy cloth, were coming forward to meet the visitors. It took some time to satisfy them that Caspian was a friend and not an enemy, but when they did, they all cried,
"Long live the king!"
And their gifts were noble. Mail shirts and helmets and swords for Caspian and Trumpkin and Knickerbrick. The badger could have had the same if he had liked, but he said he was a beast, he was, and if his claws and teeth could not keep his skin whole, it wasn't worth keeping. The workmanship of the arms was far finer than any Caspian had ever seen, and he gladly accepted the dwarf-made sword instead of his own, which looked in comparison as feeble as a toy and as clumsy as a stick. The 7 brothers, who were all red dwarfs, promised to come to the feast at Dancing Lawn. A little farther on, in a dry, rocky ravine, they reached the cave of 5 black dwarfs. They looked suspiciously at Caspian, but in the end, the eldest of them said,
"If he is against Miraz, we'll have him for king."
And the next oldest said,
"Shall we go farther up for you, up to the crags? There's an ogre or 2 and a hag that we could introduce you to up there."
"Certainly not," said Caspian.
"I should think not indeed,"
said Truffle Hunter.
"We want none of that sort on our side."
Knickerbrick disagreed with this, but Trumpkin and the Badger overruled him. It gave Caspian a shock to realize that the horrible creatures out of the old stories, as well as the nice ones, had some descendants in Narnia still.
"We should not have Aslan for a friend if we brought in that rabble,"
said Truffle Hunter as they came away from the cave of the black dwarfs.
"Oh, Aslan,"
said Trumpkin, cheerily but contemptuously.
"what matters much more is that you wouldn't have me."
"Do you believe in Aslan?" said Caspian to Knickerbrick.
"I'll believe in anyone or anything,"
said Knickerbrick,
"that'll batter these cursed Telmarine barbarians to pieces or drive them out of Narnia. Anyone or anything, Aslan or the White Witch, do you understand?" "Silence, silence,"
said Truffle Hunter.
"You do not know what you are saying. She was a worse enemy than Miraz and all his race." "Not to dwarves, she wasn't,"
said Knickerbrick. Their next visit was a pleasanter one. As they came lower down, the mountains opened out into a great glen or wooded forge with a swift river running at the bottom. The open places near the river's edge were a mass of foxgloves and wild roses, and the air was buzzing with bees. Here, Truffle Hunter called again,
"Glenstorm! Glenstorm!"
and after a pause, Caspian heard the sound of hooves. It grew louder till the valley trembled, and at last, breaking and trampling the thickets, there came in sight the noblest creatures that Caspian had yet seen, the great centaur Glenstorm and his 3 sons. His flanks were glossy chestnut, and the beard that covered his broad chest was golden red. He was a prophet and a stargazer, and knew what they had come about.
"Long live the king!"
he cried.
"I and my sons are ready for war. When is the battle to be joined?"
Up till now, neither Caspian nor the others had really been thinking of a war. They had some vague idea, perhaps, of an occasional raid on some human farmstead, or of attacking a party of hunters, if it ventured too far into these southern wilds. But in the main, they had thought only of living to themselves in woods and caves, and building up an attempt at old Narnia in hiding. As soon as Glenstorm had spoken, everyone felt much more serious. "Do you mean a real war to drive Miraz out of Narnia?" asked Caspian.
"What else?"
said the centaur.
"Why else does your majesty go clad in mail and girt with sword?"
"Is it possible, Glenstorm?"
said the badger.
"The time is ripe,"
said Glenstorm.
"I watch the skies, Badger, for it is mine to watch as it is yours to remember. Tarva and Alambil have met in the halls of high heaven, and on earth a son of Adam has once more arisen to rule and name the creatures. The hour has struck. Our council at the Dancing Lawn must be a council of war."
He spoke in such a voice that neither Caspian nor the others hesitated for a moment. It now seemed to them quite possible that they might win a war, and quite certain that they must wage one. As it was now past the middle of the day, they rested with the centaurs and ate such food as the centaurs provided, cakes of oaten meal and apples and herbs and wine and cheese. The next place they were to visit was quite near at hand, but they had to go a long way round in order to avoid a region in which men lived. It was well into the afternoon before they found themselves in level fields, warm between hedgerows. There, Truffle Hunter called at the mouth of a little hole in a green bank, and out popped the last thing Caspian expected, a talking mouse. He was, of course, bigger than a common mouse, well over a foot high when he stood on his hind legs, and with ears nearly as long, though broader, than a rabbit's. His name was Reepicheep, and he was a gay and martial mouse. He wore a tiny little rapier at his side and twirled his long whiskers as if they were a mustache.
There are 12 of us, sire,"
he said with a dashing and graceful bow.
"and I place all the resources of my people unreservedly at your majesty's disposal."
Caspian tried hard, and successfully, not to laugh, but he couldn't help thinking that Reepicheep and all his people could very easily be put in a washing basket and carried home on one's back. It would take too long to mention all the creatures whom Caspian met that day. Clodsley Shovel the mole, the three hardbiters, who were badgers like Truffle Hunter, Camilo the hare, and Hogglestock the hedgehog. They rested at last beside a well at the edge of a wide and level circle of grass, bordered with tall elms, which now threw long shadows across it. For the sun was setting, the daisies closing, and the rooks flying home to bed. Here they supped on food they had brought with them, and Trumpkin lit his pipe. Knickerbrick was not a smoker.
"Now,"
said the badger,
"if only we could wake the spirits of these trees and this well, we should have done a good day's work."
"Can't we?" said Caspian.
"No,"
said Truffle Hunter.
"we have no power over them. Since the humans came into the land, felling trees and defiling streams, the dryads and naiads have sunk into a deep sleep. Who knows if they will ever stir again? And that is a great loss to our side. The Telmarines are horribly afraid of the woods, and once the trees moved in anger, our enemies would go mad with fright and be chased out of Narnia as quick as their legs could carry them." "What imaginations you animals have,"
said Trumpkin, who didn't believe in such things.
"Why stop at trees and waters? Wouldn't it be even nicer if the stones started throwing themselves at old Miraz?"
The badger only grunted at this, and after that there was such a silence that Caspian had nearly dropped off to sleep when he thought he heard a faint musical sound from the depth of the woods at his back. Then he thought it was only a dream and turned over again. But as soon as his ear touched the ground, he felt or heard, it is hard to tell which, a faint beating or drumming. He raised his head. The beating noise at once became fainter, but the music returned, clearer this time. It was like flutes. He saw that Truffle Hunter was sitting up, staring into the wood. The moon was bright. Caspian had been asleep longer than he thought. Nearer and nearer came the music, a tune wild and yet dreamy, and the noise of many light feet, till at last, out from the wood into the moonlight, came dancing shapes such as Caspian had been thinking of all his life. They were not much taller than dwarves, but far slighter and more graceful. Their curly heads had little horns, the upper part of their bodies gleamed naked in the pale light, but their legs and feet were those of goats. "Fawns!" cried Caspian, jumping up, and in a moment they were all round him. It took next to no time to explain the whole situation to them, and they accepted Caspian at once. Before he knew what he was doing, he found himself joining in the dance. Trumpkin, with heavier and jerkier movements, did likewise, and even Truffle Hunter hopped and lumbered about as best he could. Only Knickerbrick stayed where he was, looking on in silence. The fawns footed it all round Caspian to their speedy pipes. Their strange faces, which seemed mournful and merry all at once, looked into his, dozens of fawns, Manitus and Obanitus and Dumas and Volans and Voltinius and Gerbius and Nimnius, Nassus and Oscanus. Pattertwig had sent them all. When Caspian awoke next morning, he could hardly believe that it had not all been a dream, but the grass was covered with little cloven hoof marks. The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. Book 2, Prince Caspian. Chapter 7, Old Narnia in Danger. The place where they had met the fawns was, of course, Dancing Lawn itself, and here Caspian and his friends remained till the night of the great council. To sleep under the stars, to drink nothing but well water, and to live chiefly on nuts and wild fruit was a strange experience for Caspian after his bed with silken sheets in a tapestried chamber at the castle, with meals laid out on gold and silver dishes in the anteroom, and attendants ready at his call. But he had never enjoyed himself more. Never had sleep been more refreshing, nor food tasted more savory, and he began already to harden, and his face wore a kinglier look. When the great night came, and his various strange subjects came stealing into the lawn by ones and twos and threes, or by sixes and sevens, the moon was shining almost at her full. His heart swelled as he saw their numbers and heard their greetings. All whom he had met were there, bulgy bears and red dwarfs and black dwarfs, moles and badgers, hares and hedgehogs, and others whom he had not yet seen, 5 satyrs as red as foxes, the whole contingent of talking mice, armed to the teeth, and following a shrill trumpet. Some owls, the old raven of Ravenscar, last of all, and this took Caspian's breath away. With the centaurs came a small but genuine giant, Wimbleweather of Dead Man's Hill, carrying on his back a basketful of rather seasick dwarfs, who had accepted his offer of a lift and were now wishing they had walked instead. The Bulgy Bears were very anxious to have the feast first and leave the council till afterwards, perhaps till tomorrow. Reepicheep and his mice said that councils and feasts could both wait, and proposed storming Miraz in his own castle that very night. Pattertwig and the other squirrels said they could talk and eat at the same time, so why not have the council and feast all at once? The moles proposed throwing up entrenchments round the lawn before they did anything else. The fawns thought it would be better to begin with a solemn dance. The old raven, while agreeing with the bears that it would take too long to have a full council before supper, begged to be allowed to give a brief address to the whole company. But Caspian and the centaurs and the dwarves overruled all these suggestions and insisted on holding a real council of war at once. When all the other creatures had been persuaded to sit down quietly in a great circle, and when, with more difficulty, they had got Pattertwig to stop running to and fro and saying, "Silence! Silence, everyone, for the king's speech!" Caspian, feeling a little nervous, got up. "Narnians," he began. But he never got any further, for at that very moment, Camilo the hare said, "Hush! There's a man somewhere near." They were all creatures of the wild, accustomed to being hunted, and they all became still as statues. The beasts all turned their noses in the direction which Camilo had indicated.
"Smells like man, and yet not quite like man,"
whispered Truffle Hunter.
"It's getting steadily nearer,"
said Camilo. "2 badgers and you three dwarves, with your bows at the ready, go softly off to meet it," said Caspian.
"We'll settle it,"
said the black dwarf grimly, fitting a shaft to his bowstring. "Don't shoot if it is alone," said Caspian. "Catch it."
"Why?"
asked the dwarf.
"Do as you're told,"
said Glindstorm the centaur. Everyone waited in silence while the 3 dwarves and 2 badgers trotted stealthily across to the trees on the northwest side of the lawn. Then came a sharp dwarfish cry,
"Stop! Who goes there?"
and a sudden spring. A moment later came a voice which Caspian knew well, could be heard saying, all right, I'm unarmed. Take my wrists if you like, worthy badgers, but don't bite right through them. I want to speak to the king." "Dr. Cornelius!" cried Caspian with joy, and rushed forward to greet his old tutor. Everyone else crowded round.
"Pah!"
said Knickerbrick.
"A renegade dwarf, and a half-and-halfer. Shall I pass my sword through its throat?" "Be quiet, Knickerbrick,"
said Trumpkin.
"The creature can't help its ancestry."
"This is my greatest friend and the savior of my life," said Caspian, "and anyone who doesn't like his company may leave my army at once. Dearest doctor, I am glad to see you again. However did you find us out?"
"By a little use of simple magic, your majesty,"
said the doctor, who was still puffing and blowing from having walked so fast.
"But there's no time to go into that now. We must all fly from this place at once. You are already betrayed, and Miraz is on the move. Before midday tomorrow, you will be surrounded."
"Betrayed?" said Caspian. "And by whom?"
"Another renegade dwarf, no doubt,"
said Knickerbrick.
"By your horse, Destrier," said
Dr. Cornelius.
"The poor brute knew no better. When you were knocked off, of course, he went dawdling back to his stable in the castle. Then the secret of your flight was known. I made myself scarce, having no wish to be questioned about it in Miraz's torture chamber. I had a pretty good guess from my crystal as to where I should find you. But all day, that was the day before yesterday, I saw Miraz's tracking parties out in the woods. Yesterday, I learned that his army is out. I don't think some of your pure-blooded dwarfs have as much woodcraft as might be expected. They've left tracks all over the place. Great carelessness. At any rate, something has warned Miraz that old Narnia is not so dead as he had hoped, and he is on the move." "Hooray!"
said a very shrill and small voice from somewhere at the doctor's feet.
"Let them come. All I ask is that the king will put me and my people in the front." "What on earth,"
said Dr. Cornelius,
Has your majesty got grasshoppers or mosquitoes in your army?
Then, after stooping down and peering carefully through his spectacles, he broke into a laugh.
By the lion, he swore, it's a mouse! Signor Mouse, I desire your better acquaintance. I am honored by meeting so valiant a beast. Yep. My friendship you shall have, learned man,
piped Reepicheep.
And any dwarf or giant in the army who does not give you good language shall have my sword to reckon with. Is there time for this foolery?
Asked Knickerbrick.
What are our plans, battle or flight? Battle if need be, said Trumpkin, but we are hardly ready for it yet, and this is no very defensible place.
I don't like the idea of running away.
Hear him, said the Bulgy Bears. Whatever we do, don't let's have any running. Especially not before supper and not too soon after it, neither. Those who run first do not always run last, said the centaur. And why should we let the enemy choose our position instead of choosing it ourselves? Let us find a strong place.
That's wise, your majesty, that's wise,
said Truffle Hunter. But where are we to go? Asked several voices.
Your majesty, said
Dr. Cornelius,
and all you variety of creatures, I think we must fly east and down the river to the great woods. The Telmarines hate that region. They have always been afraid of the sea and of something that may come over the sea. That is why they have let the great woods grow up. If traditions speak true, the ancient Cair Paravel was at the river mouth. Oh, that part is friendly to us and hateful to our enemies. We must go to Aslan's How.
Aslan's How, said several voices. We do not know what it is.
It lies within the skirts of the great woods, and it is a huge mound which Narnians raised in very ancient times, or a very magical place, where there stood, and perhaps still stands, a very magical stone. The mound is all hollowed out within into galleries and caves, and the stone in the central cave of all. There is room in the mound for all our stores, and those who have most need of cover and are most accustomed to underground life can be lodged in the caves. The rest of us can lie in the wood. At a pinch, all of us, except this worthy giant, could retreat into the mound itself, and there we should be beyond the reach of every danger except famine. It is a good thing we have a learned man among us,
said Truffle Hunter, but Trumpkin muttered under his breath.
Soup and celery. I wish our leaders would think less about these old wives' tale and more about victuals and arms.
But all approved of Cornelius's proposal, and that very night, half an hour later, they were on the march. Before sunrise, they arrived at Aslan's How. It was certainly an awesome place, a round green hill on top of another hill, long since grown over with trees, and one little low doorway leading into it. The tunnels inside were a perfect maze till you got to know them, and they were lined and roofed with smooth stones, and on the stones, peering in the twilight, Caspian saw strange characters and snaky patterns, and pictures in which the form of a lion was repeated again and again. It all seemed to belong to an even older Narnia than the Narnia of which his nurse had told him. It was after they had taken up their quarters in and around the How that fortune began to turn against them. King Miraz's scouts soon found their new lair, and he and his army arrived on the verge of the woods. And as so often happens, the enemy turned out stronger than they had reckoned. Caspian's heart sank as he saw company after company arriving, and though Miraz's men may have been afraid of going into the wood, they were even more afraid of Miraz, and with him in command, they carried battle deeply into it, and sometimes almost to the How itself. Caspian and other captains, of course, made many sorties into the open country. Thus there was fighting on most days, and sometimes by night as well, but Caspian's party had on the whole the worst of it. At last there came a night when everything had gone as badly as possible, and the rain which had been falling heavily all day had ceased at nightfall only to give place to raw cold. That morning Caspian had arranged what was his biggest battle yet, and all had hung their hopes on it. He, with most of the dwarves, was to have fallen on the king's right wing at daybreak, and then, when they were heavily engaged, giant Wimbleweather, with the centaurs and some of the fiercer beasts, was to have broken out from another place and endeavored to cut through the king's right off from the rest of the army. But it had all failed. No one had warned Caspian, because no one in these later days of Narnia remembered that giants are not at all clever. Poor Wimbleweather, though as brave as a lion, was a true giant in that respect. He had broken out at the wrong time and from the wrong place, and both his party and Caspian's had suffered badly and done the enemy little harm. The best of the bears had been hurt, a centaur terribly wounded, and there were few in Caspian's party who had not lost blood. It was a gloomy company that huddled under the dripping trees to eat their scanty supper. The gloomiest of all was giant Wimbleweather. He knew it was all his fault. He sat in silence, shedding big tears, which collected on the end of his nose and then fell off with a huge splash on the whole bivouac of the mice, who were just beginning to get warm and drowsy. They all jumped up, shaking the water out of their ears and wringing their little blankets, and asked the giant in shrill but forcible voices whether he thought they weren't wet enough without this sort of thing. And then other people woke up and told the mice they had been enrolled as scouts and not as a concert party, and asked why they couldn't keep quiet. Wimbleweather tiptoed away to find some place where he could be miserable in peace, and stepped on somebody's tail, and somebody, they said afterwards it was a fox, bit him. And so everyone was out of temper. But in the secret and magical chamber at the heart of the How, King Caspian, with Cornelius and the Badger and Knickerbrick and Trumpkin, were at council. Thick pillars of ancient workmanship supported the roof. In the center was the stone itself, a stone table split right down the center, and covered with what had once been writing of some kind, but ages of wind and rain and snow had almost worn it away in old times when the stone table had stood on the hilltop, and the mound had not yet been built above it. They were not using the table, nor sitting round it. It was too magic a thing for any common use. They sat on logs a little way from it, and between them was a rough wooden table on which stood a rude clay lamp, lighting up their pale faces and throwing big shadows on the walls.
"If your majesty is ever to use the horn," said Truffle Hunter, "I think the time has now come."
Caspian had of course told them of his treasure several days ago. "We are certainly in great need," answered Caspian, "but it is hard to be sure we are at our greatest. Supposing there came an even worse need and we had already used it."
"By that argument," said Knickerbrick, "your majesty will never use it until it is too late." "I agree with that," said Dr. Cornelius.
"And what do you think, Trumpkin?"
"Oh, as for me," said the Red Dwarf, who had been listening with complete indifference, "your majesty knows I think the horn and that bit of broken stone over there and your great King Peter and your lion Aslan are all eggs and moonshine. It's all one to me when your majesty blows the horn. All I insist on is that the army is told nothing about it. There's no good raising hopes of magical help, which, as I think, are sure to be disappointed."
"Then in the name of Aslan we will wind Queen Susan's horn," said Caspian.
"There is one thing, sire," said Dr. Cornelius, "that should perhaps be done first. We do not know what form the help will take. It might call Aslan himself from overseas, but I think it is more likely to call Peter the High King and his mighty consorts down from the high past. But in either case, I do not think we can be sure that the help will come to this very spot." "You never said a truer word," put in Trumpkin. "I think," went on the learned man, "that they, or he, will come back to one of the other of the ancient places in Narnia. This, where we now sit, is the most ancient and the most deeply magical of all, and here I think the answer is likeliest to come. But there are two others. One is Lantern Waste, upriver west of Beaver's Dam, where the royal children first appeared in Narnia, as the records tell. The other is down the river mouth, where their castle of Cair Paravel once stood. And if Aslan himself comes, that would be the best place for meeting him too, for every story says that he is the son of the great emperor over the sea, and over the sea he will pass. I should like very much to send messengers to both places, to Lantern Waste and the river mouth, to receive them, or him, or it." "Just as I thought," muttered Trumpkin. "The first result of all this foolery is not to bring us help, but to lose us 2 fighters."
"Who would you think of sending, Dr. Cornelius?" asked Caspian.
"Squirrels are best for getting through enemy country without being caught," said Truffle Hunter. "All our squirrels, and we haven't many," said Knickerbrick, "are rather flighty. The only one I'd trust on a job like that would be Pattertwig."
Let it be Pattertwig, then, said King Caspian. And who for our other messenger? I know you'd go, Truffle Hunter, but you haven't the speed. Nor you, Dr. Cornelius.
I won't go, said Knickerbrick. With all these humans and beasts about, there must be a dwarf here to see that the dwarves are fairly treated. Thimbles and thunderstorms, cried Trumpkin in a rage. Is that how you speak to the king? Send me, sire, I'll go.
But I thought you didn't believe in the horn, Trumpkin, said Caspian.
No more I do, your majesty. Well, what's that got to do with it? I might as well die on a wild goose chase as die here. You are my king. I know the difference between giving advice and taking orders. You've had my advice, and now it's the time for orders.
I will never forget this, Trumpkin, said Caspian. Send for Pattertwig, one of you. And when shall I blow the horn?
I would wait for sunrise, your majesty, said Dr. Cornelius. That sometimes has an effect in operations of white magic.
A few minutes later, Pattertwig arrived and had his task explained to him. As he was, like many squirrels, full of courage and dash and energy and excitement and mischief, not to say conceit, he no sooner heard it than he was eager to be off. It was arranged that he should run for Lantern Waste, while Trumpkin made the shorter journey to the river mouth. After a hasty meal, they both set off with fervent thanks and good wishes of the king, the Badger, and Cornelius.